Now, I personally suck at design, and so one of the things that impressed me about FlutterFlow is just how simple and powerful the design and layout system is. And so once you master some of the basic fundamentals, you'll be able to stitch together any kind of design out there, whether you're building a simple app or a much more complicated app. And if someone like myself can master the design aspects of building an app, then trust me, you'll be able to build just about any kind of design that you want by the time you finish watching this video. Now, before we get started, as always, all the apps and all the resources that I mentioned in these videos, you can view and or clone them by accessing our amazing Patreon community. And you can learn more about our incredibly awesome Patreon community via a link in the description below this video. Now, this video is going to be split into two parts. In the first part, I'm going to be teaching you the design fundamentals when it comes to designing your app, regardless if it's a simple app or a more complex app. I'm also going to be telling you some of the things that you should watch out for and some of the errors that you're going to see and how to fix them. And then the second part of the video, we are going to attempt to replicate some very interesting and innovative mobile app designs so that you can see how you can implement them with FlutterFlow. Now, when you first create a page in FlutterFlow, chances are you're going to have a structure that looks something like this. You're going to have your column and you're going to have your app bar with text. Now, the stuff that you want to place in order to kind of see it on the page, you're going to be putting it inside of this column. And so column is the first element that I want to cover. And what exactly is a column? Well, anything that you put inside of a column is going to be aligned vertically. So it's going to be aligned from top to bottom. So if I click here and I add a text, it's going to be here, but the next text I add, it's going to be below it, right? So if I add more elements, I add an image, it's going to be right below it. And the reason you're seeing this behavior is that when you add elements to a column, it automatically arranges them vertically, right? From top to bottom. And so I can keep adding elements and you're going to have the same exact behavior. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to delete them right now. And then we're back to our empty page. Now, the second important layout element that you need to understand is the row, right? So I can add a row inside of a column. Any element that I place inside of a row, not inside of a column, is going to be aligned horizontally. So I can add a child here. I can add a text widget. And the next element that I add is going to be aligned horizontally inside of this row. So I can add, another text, I can add another image, and they're going to be aligned in a horizontal fashion, okay? And so why is this happening? Well, the reason this is happening is that things inside of a row are going to be automatically aligned horizontally. So I'm going to go ahead and delete this row, and now I'm back to an empty page. The next important element that you need to understand is a stack. So what exactly is a stack? Well, unlike a column or a row layout, a stack places things above the existing elements, okay? So let me show you what I mean. So let's say I have a column here and I can add an image. So now I have an image, and if I add more elements, they are going to be placed in kind of a vertical fashion. So I can add another image here, and it's going to be placed vertically. Now, let's say I want to place something on top of this image. So let's say I want to place a button on top of this image. Well, if I add a button like this, it's just going to place it below it, right? Because these elements are inside of a column. So how exactly do I move this button and let's say put it on top of this image? Well, here's how you do it. First, we're going to delete that image and that button. And the next thing that we need to do is we need to take the element that we want to place something on top of, and we need to wrap it inside of a stack. So if you select this image, you right click, and what you want to do is you want to click on wrap widget, and then you can select a stack. And what that does is it puts a stack as the parent of that widget. And so once we created a stack as the parent of this image, all the children inside of the stack are going to be arranged with one being on top of each other. So the next element, the next child after image is going to be arranged not after image or not next to image, but it's going to be on top of image, right? So if you click here, And let's say we search for a button. Well, guess what? It's not going to be arranged next to the image or below the image. It's going to be arranged on top of this image, okay? And so what we've just done is we created an image and a button that are children of a stack, and therefore we have a button that lays on top of this image. Now we can, of course, put this button as the first child, and now as you can see, this button disappears, and that is because the image is the second one. The image is the last one, and so as you can see, the image is the last one, and so it kind of goes over the button. And so if we drag and drop it to make it the first element, with the button being the second element, we can now see the button here. Now, of course, we can arrange the button pretty much anywhere that we want, and we're going to be talking about that in just a second. But here I wanted to show you a quick stack example. Now, it's important to understand that you can have many levels of rows inside of columns, inside of rows, inside of columns as you want, and that leads to very, very intricate and very, very complex layouts that are relatively easy to do. So if you take a look at this right here, we have a row, and each row has several text elements. And just like how I explained, anytime you dump something inside a row, it's going to be arranged next to each other, right? It's not going to be arranged from top to bottom. It's going to be arranged from left to right. Now, you might be looking at this design and you might be thinking to yourself, well, I like this design, but I want to change something. So for instance, in this text field that I have here, instead of having just one text field, I want to have maybe 2 elements or 3 elements. And I want to arrange them in a way where, one element is above the other. Well, how would you be able to do that? Well, it's actually very, very simple. What you can do is you can add a column inside of this row, and then when you add elements inside of this column, they're going to be arranged vertically, right? So I have this column. Now I can take this element, I can drag and drop it here, and nothing changed. It's the exact same design as before. And that is because we only have one element. Now, let's say I take this element and I duplicate it. Well, now we have a column element inside of a row, right? So this column is going to be arranged with respect to another element horizontally, but the stuff inside the column are going to be arranged vertically. And so now I have 2 elements that are arranged vertically. And so let's say I put, Walmart or something like that. And now what we have is a row, and then everything inside the row is obviously going to be horizontal. This element here, inside of it, right, is going to be vertical, right? Now I can also go further, right? Let's say I want to create some kind of an icon that's displayed on top of this right here. Well, in that case, what I can do is I can take this column, I can wrap it inside of a stack. All the children of a stack are going to be arranged with one on top of another. And so I can add an icon. I can search for an icon here, and this icon is going to be on top of the stack here, right? So now this stack has 2 children, right? The stack has a column, with that column having 2 elements, but it also has an icon. And so now I have an icon that has been placed on top of this column, partially covering one of the elements there. If you can't see it, I can quickly change the color right here, so I can make it maybe red. And now you can see this icon right here. And so what we have now is we have an initial column, which represents the entire page. We have a row here. Next, we have a stack, and inside the stack, we have a column and we have an icon. And the way to think about it is that this row here, it has 3 elements. It has a stack, text, and text. And whatever is inside the stack is obviously going to be placed one on top of the other, one children above the other child. And so that means this icon is going to be placed on top of a column. And this column has 2 text elements that are going to be arranged with one being on top of the previous one. And so as a result of knowing just 3 layout elements, rows, columns, and a stack, you can build some very, very interesting and complicated designs very, very quickly and easily. Now, apart from rows, columns, and stacks, there are some elements, some widgets that you're going to be using very, very frequently. And so I want to cover them now and explain to you some of the ways that you will be utilizing these widgets. The first widget that you're going to be using all the time is a container. Now, what exactly is a container? Well, by itself, a container doesn't really do anything. So for instance, I have this list here, and let's say I add a container to this column. So it's going to be somewhere here. And so I'm going to search, I'm going to add a container, and now you're seeing a container. I can remove the width, I can remove the height, and you don't even see a container now. It's there. It's still there. It's right here, but you don't see it because a container is only useful when it's a parent of another widget. So if I add a child to it, now a container is going to be useful. So let's say I add text inside of a container. Now you see the container and you also see the child text widget. And so what's happening here is that once we added a child, this container now has a meaning. It has a purpose in life. And that is to add some kind of a decoration or some kind of a design element to its children. So for instance, let's say I select this container and I specify a width and a height. So let's say a width is 100, height is 100. So now, as you can see, this container is bigger, right? Because we specified a width and a height. If you do not specify a width and you do not specify a height, the container is going to take up the space of its children. So if you don't really care about, the container being a certain width or a certain height, then you don't have to specify it. And as a result, the container is just going to wrap the children that are inside of it. Another thing that you can do with the container is you can give it fill color. So I can come in here and I can make it something like light gray. And as a result, this container has this light gray. I can also give it a border color, right? So I can give it maybe a red border color. And so now you can see right here, it has a red border color. Another thing that I can do with a container is I can give it a box shadow. I can click here and I can give it this kind of external shadow. As you can see it, I can also specify, how much blur I want, how much spread I want. Maybe that's a little too much. Something like this, and that gives it a nice effect right there. I can also give it a gradient. I can click here and I have a gradient for the container. I can choose my colors, this color, and it creates a gradient for this container. I can also add a background image for a container. So I can click here, specify the image, and this container is going to have a background image. So really, when you think about a container, it serves two purposes. One is to kind of separate different pieces of content on your page. So for instance, maybe we have this order history and we have this list here where I can take this list, wrap it inside of a container, and that's going to separate it from maybe some other piece of content here. Another thing that containers allow us to do is they allow us to style the elements that the container contains, meaning its children. Many of the things that I talked about that you can do with this container, such as giving it a background color, a shadow, a border, all of these things you can't really do with other elements. So if I select this row here, well, guess what? I can't really give it a background color. I can't give it that blur effect. I can't give it a border. A row, after all, is just for laying out the elements vertically. It's not for styling them. It's not for doing some of these special effects that a container does really, really well. And it's the exact same thing with rows, right? So if I click on this row, I can't really do anything. I can't really have a lot of fun with these elements. I can't really give it a background color, background image, border color, or anything that I've just done with this container right here. So containers are very, very important, and chances are when you're seeing some very, very interesting apps with a different background color, maybe, rounded corners, and a lot of these interesting things that make an app really, really aesthetically pleasing, chances are a lot of these effects are being accomplished with the use of containers. Now, the next types of widgets that I want to talk about are the widgets that allow you to list multiple elements in different ways. Now, the first widget that I want to talk about is a list view, and this is a universal widget for listing pieces of data. And it doesn't matter where you're getting this data, whether this is an API call, Firestore DB, app state, page state, doesn't really matter. If you have lots of data to list, chances are you're going to be working with a list view. So here I am back on this page right here. And if you take a look at this page, we kind of have a list already, except these are static elements, right? We're not getting them from a database. We're not getting them from anywhere. The elements that you see right now are the exact elements that the user is going to see. These are static elements. These are not dynamic. And so what we can do is we can select a row and right click, and what we can say is wrap widget. And here we can select the list view. And what that's going to do is it's going to take this row and make it a child of a list view. Now, a list view works like this. It looks at its child elements and it says, okay, I have a child element. And so I'm going to replicate those child elements amount of times that I have a list of items. So if I have 10 list of items, I'm going to replicate those children 10 times. Now, at this point, this list view is not doing anything. And the reason it's not doing anything is that we haven't given it a data source. And so if you select this list view, you can give it a data source. There are two ways of giving it a data source. You can click here on the backend query, click on add backend query, and you can do a query collection document from reference API called Algolia search. Or if you already have that list of elements, for instance, as part of app state or page state, like I have here. So if you go into this app state, I have this string list. And if you click here, you can see that I have a list of 10 European countries here. So if I go back here, what I need to do now is I need to click on Generate Dynamic Children, click here, select my app state, and select the list here. Click confirm and then give it a name. Click confirm. And now this list view right here, this part here, not this part here, just this part here, is gonna be dynamically generated with the items that I specified. Now there's still a couple of things that I need to do. I need to actually set the specific items that I want to show as part of this list view. So for instance, I can select this field here, click on it, click here, select this country's item, and click confirm. And now when we run the app, this thing here, this list view is going to be dynamically generated from our app state. And so here's the app. And as you can see, we have here a list view. So from Spain to the Czech Republic, we have a list of countries that were dynamically generated as part of this list view with the data that we gave it. These items here are those static items that we defined on the app. And unlike this list view that is dynamically generating the items, these items here are static. And so the way that we're seeing them now, they're going to appear the exact same way throughout the time that the app is running, whereas these items can change if we happen to change the data. Now, list views are not the only way that you can list multiple pieces of data. There are two more widgets that you need to know about, and those widgets are a grid view and a wrap. And so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to swap out this list view for a grid view. So I'm going to click here, and I'm going to remove this widget. Once I remove it, our list view is gone. And so I'm going to select this row, right click, wrap widget, and I'm going to select a grid view right here, okay? And as a result, this thing here became a grid view. Now, what exactly is a grid view? Well, it is exactly what it says. It's a way to lay out the elements in a grid-like fashion. So if I select this grid view, I can come down and I can choose how many elements do I want to position inside this grid view. Do I want like a 2x2 grid, a 3x3, etc., etc. So for instance, this grid view has an axis that is vertical, right? So this is this axis right here. And a cross axis represents an axis that is the opposite of the main axis. So if the main axis is vertical, a cross axis is going to be the horizontal axis. And it's the same way in reverse, right? If this is horizontal, a cross axis is going to be vertical. And so we're going to keep this on vertical. And so let's say I want to set up this grid view to have two columns. And so in that case, I'm going to put 2 here. So the cross axis count is going to be 2. I'm going to change the spacing. I don't need so much spacing. And now we have this one element here, right? This row. Remember, the child of the grid view is the element that it's going to display. And so just like with the previous list view example, whatever the child is of the grid view, that is what is going to display it here as the elements inside the grid view. And so now we need to set up the data feed to this grid view, just like how we did it with the list view. So I'm going to click on grid view here. I'm going to click here. I'm going to click here. I'm going to go into app state, select my string list, confirm, country item here, confirm. Okay, and now we have a grid view that's going to display some kind of a data, more specifically the data that we have inside. So this is a row here. So essentially the cells inside of a grid view are going to have a row. Now there's lots of elements, so I can probably delete a couple of elements here, delete this. And now we can select this one text element inside of a row, click here, and we can just select country item. And as a result, what we're going to see is we're going to see a list of items displayed in kind of this grid view layout instead of that list view layout where we had one after the other. So let me go ahead and reload this app here. I'm going to do an instant reload and let's see how this app looks. All right, and this is our new app. And as you can see, this is the grid view. And these are the items here, right? These are the cells inside the grid view. And at the bottom of this page, we can see this static list of rows that we saw in our previous example as well. And so whatever you put as a child of a grid view in turn is going to arrange it as a grid. And so if you put something else, if you put an image, so let's say I have a row and I put an image here, and let's say I delete the original text, well, now I'm going to have a grid of different images here. So I can come back here, do an instant reload, and we should see some sample images being displayed as a grid. And so here's our new app. And as you can see, we are seeing images being displayed as a grid, except there's one problem, is that the images are overflowing. As you can see, it says here, right overflowed by 138 pixels. And so what this means is that these images, the way that they're being displayed, they're too big for this specific setup that we have. And this can happen with pretty much any widget. It could be a text widget, it could be an image. And so if you do not align them properly, you're going to have an overflow issue. And a little bit later in the video, I'm going to show you why this issue happens and how you can fix it once and for all. This was an example of a grid view, but there's one more element that you may use from time to time to display a list of data, and that is a wrap. So we're going to come back to this grid view, right click, remove widget, and now we're going to click on this row, right click, wrap widget, and we're going to select a wrap right here. Now, what exactly is a wrap? Well, a wrap is kind of in between a list view and a grid view, okay? Whereas a grid view is very, very strict when it comes to aligning items and making everything look like a grid. A wrap, on the other hand, just wraps items with the way that you specify. And so let's say you have a list of items and you're not too concerned with them needing to look like a grid. You're not really looking for that kind of strict grid layout, but you do not want these items to go beyond the available viewing area. Okay, you want those items to essentially wrap. Okay, so if you have like a bunch of images or a bunch of text or whatever you have, a bunch of cards, a bunch of buttons, you want to list those items, but you do not want them to go beyond the available viewing area. Okay, essentially you want them to wrap. You want them to be wrapped by the available viewing area. Okay, so let me show you what I mean. So we have here a wrap and we have a row and we have an image. In fact, we don't really need a row. So just to simplify it, I'm just going to leave the image there. Okay. And so now we have a wrap. Okay. And so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to click on this wrap and I'm going to load it with data. So I'm going to click here, just like how we did it before. Click here, go to app state, and I'm going to select my list of countries. Okay. Now, obviously, I'm displaying images, and here I have a list of names, but it doesn't really matter. I have a list of 10 items, and so this means I can display a list of 10 images. Okay. For the purpose of this example, click confirm, give it a name, country item, click confirm. And now what we have is we have a wrap. And as you can see, this image here is too big. And as a result, it's only allowing one image to appear per line, so to speak. So whereas in the previous example, we had an overflow error because a grid view is very, very strict. You give it, you want to display 2 columns, so like 2 items per line. It's going to display 2 items per line, even if you have an overflow issue, meaning that even if you have items that are too big. Whereas a wrap is not going to do that. A wrap is just going to make sure that you will never have an overflow. It's just going to wrap items. And so this is kind of what we have. And so if I run this app, you're going to see that you're not going to be having an overflow issue, and you're going to have items essentially appearing one at a time. Okay, so this is our app right here. And as you can see, no more overflow issue. And you would have an overflow issue if this was a grid view, right? Because with a grid view, if you say you want to display 2 columns, it's going to display this image right here and you know, this image and this image right here, no matter what. But here, it's not going to do that. Okay, now what we can do is we can take this image and we can make it smaller. So this image is 300 by 200, and let's say I make it 50 by 40 instead. Well, now our layout is going to be very, very different. So let's say I reload this, and you will see the difference. And so as you can see, the layout is very, very different than before, than with the grid, than with the list view. And so what's happening here is that it took the first 7 items, 7 images, and it laid them out in a row. Okay, and that is because it was able to fit 7 of these images with this image size that we specified in a row, but it wasn't able to fit the other 3 images, and that is why they are in the second row. Okay, now if we come here and we click on this wrap, and let's say we select this image here, and we say, okay, I want 100 by 100. Okay, well, now it's going to be different, right? Now we won't be able to fit so many images in a row, but we can still fit more than 1 image, right? So if we go back here, we do an instant reload, you're going to see that we should have somewhere in between 1 image and between 7 images, because our images are larger now. And as you can see, it's almost kind of a grid view now. We have 3 images here, but we have this 1 image that's kind of left out, right? Because we have 9 images here and then 1 more for a total of 10 images, because we have 10 items. Okay, now there are a couple of things that you can configure with a wrap. So if you click on this wrap right here, you go to this property settings, you can do your spacing, right? So you can do spacing. As you can see, it's now spaced out. You can have your direction. You can specify horizontal or vertical, right? So we had horizontal. Spacing is going to be horizontal. Next, you have your alignment. So you have things like start, center, end, space evenly around and between. And this is your standard FlutterFlow alignment. This applies to pretty much all the widgets. And I'm going to be covering alignment a little bit later in the video. Very, very important topic. We also have cross-axis alignment. So if you think about our main axis is horizontal, cross-axis is going to be vertical. Whereas if you make your main axis vertical, cross-axis is going to be horizontal. Then you also have vertical direction. Do you want to go down? Do you want to go up? So if you think about a wrap, what is a wrap? Well, a wrap essentially guarantees that, you know, the way you list your items, they will never go beyond the viewing area that the wrap is part of. So in this case, a wrap is a child of column. And so no matter what you do, the items inside of this wrap, they're never going to go beyond what, you know, the column's viewing area is. And so anytime that you want to make sure that, you know, you're listing a bunch of elements, whether you're doing horizontally or you're doing vertically, and you want to make sure that these elements never go beyond the parent's viewing area, they never go off the screen, they're always going to be as part of the screen, then you should be using a wrap. Very, very nice. And in that case, you should be using a wrap, because that's exactly what a wrap is going to do for you. All right, so now that we've covered the main layout elements that you need to know in order to create just about any kind of layout out there, the next topic I want to talk about is equally important, and this is the topic of alignment. Okay, how exactly do you place those elements exactly where you want them? Okay, and so here we are back on one of our pages where we have just a list of rows inside of this column. Now, if you select one of the rows here, you can align the elements inside the row pretty much any way that you want. You can also do it inside on the actual widget level on a text element. It's really up to you. It's very flexible. Now, if I select this row right here and I scroll down, we have this row properties here, right? Now, the first thing that I have is I have this main axis size. And so what exactly is that? Well, this essentially dictates whether the specific element that we're working on is going to expand to its maximum amount or it's only going to take the minimum amount, right? So right now I have it selected on the maximum amount. Now, if I click here, as you can see, now this row has been squeezed and it's only taking up the amount that it needs and not a pixel more. And so if you compare it to this row here is taking up the maximum amount that it has, the maximum amount that it can take, whereas this one is looking at its children and it's saying this child is taking up 10 pixels, roughly speaking, right? This child is taking up 10 pixels and maybe this child is taking up 15 pixels. And as a result, we can only take up 35 pixels and not more. Whereas this row here is taking up the maximum amount that it can, and then it's laying out its elements using specific settings. So if I go back to this row, and I set it to maximum, it's going to expand and then it's going to lay out its elements. Now, the way this row is actually going to align the elements is set up right here. And you have 6 ways of doing them. The first one is start, right? This places the elements in the beginning. And so if I choose that, you see it places all the elements in the beginning. This one is center, okay? It centers all the elements. This one places the elements at the end, right? Towards the end. This one right here spaces them evenly, okay? And this is something I use from time to time. This is a cool setting. This one right here spaces them around. And so it's going to give them a little bit more space. And this one here spaces them in between, which means it gives them a lot of space. And as a result, the first and last items are pretty much flush with the border, right? So this Nike store is flush with the beginning of the row, whereas the price is kind of hugging the end here, right? And that's not going to be the case if you click here and it's kind of spaced a little bit more comfortably, if you will. Whereas if you click here, it's spaced differently. You also have cross-axis alignment. And remember, with the row, the main axis is the horizontal axis, but a cross-axis is going to be the vertical axis, right? So you can align them to the top, you can align them center, bottom, or you can stretch them out here, okay? Here you can set up whether this row is going to be scrollable or not. This allows scrolling, which means that whatever I see is what I see, and if it doesn't fit, there's going to be an overflow issue. You can also do item spacing, you can do start spacing, so spacing in the beginning, spacing in the end here, and to simplify things, you can just add a value here and apply it to start and end if you want. Now, all of these properties here are going to be applicable to other types of widgets as well. So if you select a column, you're going to have similar type of settings here as well. So with a column, now you have a main axis alignment that is going to be the vertical alignment, right? So as you can see, it's aligned to the top. We can align everything. If you click here, you're going to put all of this in the center. You can, when you click here, you can align them to the bottom. And this one here spaces them evenly. Here, it spaces them even more. And this one is going to space them in ways where the first and last element is going to be hugging the margins. It's going to be hugging the parent element here. And so these settings give you some powerful ways to align the elements exactly how you want them to appear on the screen. Now, in this section, we're going to be talking about a very important part of layout called expansion, okay? So if I click on any of the elements here, so let's say I click on this text widget, if I go to the right-hand side, we see this expansion, and this is a very powerful feature, but you have to understand how it works in order to use this correctly. And so I want to show you a couple of examples, okay? So right here, I have a row that contains an image and a text. And so we have this image and we have this text. Now, this is the contents of this text to be able to fit in fully, right? So as a result, we have an overflow. And so if we would run this app, you would see that there's going to be an overflow. So let me go ahead and start this app. And so here's the app. And as you can see, there's an overflow here. There's an overflow here. There's also an overflow here. But if you take a look at this area right here, we see that the image fits in perfectly, but the text on the same row does not. Okay. And so if we go back to the app, let's take a look at how we can fix it. Well, the way that we need to fix it is we need to give this text a bound, right? We need to give it constraints. We need to tell it, look, here's how much you can take. Here's the limit. Do this with the available text, but do not go beyond that, okay? And so if we click on this text here, if we click here, and we choose this option called flexible here, now what we are seeing is we are giving it a constraint, okay? We're giving it a constraint, and as a result, this text aligned itself differently, and all of it now fits, okay? And so if you reload the app, you can see that we no longer have an overflow because all of this text fits in. And so if we go back to the app, we can also do something with the image as well. So if we click on the image and we click on flexible, the image takes less space, okay? Because it takes into account that we also have text here, and it kind of wants to make sure that both of them are able to fit in perfectly. And so that's one thing that you can do when you have overflows, is that you can give it a constraint, and you can give it a flexible constraint, and you can essentially tell it, look, align how you want, but there is a limit, okay? Don't go overboard. Don't go beyond the viewing area, okay? Now, in this next example, I want to show you another very, very important thing having to do with alignment, and that is expansion, okay? So below this, we have a row with 3 columns. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to mimic the UI of FlutterFlow. So if you take a look at the UI of FlutterFlow, you have roughly 3 columns, right? You have this one big column here. You have the canvas here where you're viewing the app, the preview area, and then right here you have the property pane here. So if you look at it kind of roughly speaking, you have 3 columns, right? You have this column that are kind of the same width, and then the rest is taken by this column. And so how would you design this kind of a UI, right? How would you design where, you have these smaller kind of, narrower columns on the sides, right? On the left and on the right hand side. But in the middle, you have a column that takes up the rest of the space. Well, anytime you hear the words take up the rest of the space, like be greedy, right? Take up the entire space, but don't take up the space of other columns, but you can take up the remaining free space. Well, anytime you kind of think like that, you should be thinking of expansion, okay? And so if you go to this row right here, all we have is a very, very simple row with 3 columns, and these are all defaults, right? And so if I click on this column and I choose this option, expansion, you see it expands right away, okay? It essentially takes up all the available free space, okay? Because on defaults, I mean, we kind of, we have our spacing and all of these things depending on how we do it. But if we wanted to kind of expand and take up the entire kind of free space and have these columns like have a really tight fit, then what you want to do is you want to select expansion. Now, another really interesting thing about it is that we can control how wide these columns are. And so, for instance, let's say I'm looking at a design where this column takes a quarter of the space, a quarter of the width, right? A quarter of the screen. This column takes another quarter of the screen, and then this whole thing takes the rest. So you have a quarter, and then 2 quarters or a half, okay? How would you do that? Well, all you have to do is click here, and then you have this flex option, right? So we're going to select expansion, but we also are going to specify the flex option. So I'm going to put 1 as the flex option. Here I'm going to select expansion. I'm going to put 1 as the flex option. And now for the middle column, right? Let's say I want it to be twice as much as any of these columns. I'm going to put 2 in there. And what we have here is we have a quarter, and then 2 quarters or 1/2, okay? Now I can also put 3 in there, right? And that's going to make it wider. And so what we have now is this is a third, and this takes up the remaining here. We can make it more. We can say 4, and this is a quarter, a quarter, and this takes up the remaining of it. And so by using expansion and flexible options, you can specify exactly how much space you want that particular widget to take. Do you want the widget to take up all the remaining space, or do you want to give that space to the widget, but by telling it, hey, you have that space, but you don't have to take it if you don't need it. So you have that option. Do you want a widget to be greedy with the space, right? Like with something like expansion, like take up all the entire available space, or do you want to say to a widget, well, you have that space, but only if you require it. Okay, and that is the main difference between the two. And by using these important features, you can avoid those annoying overflowing errors. Now, in this last part of the video, I want to take high quality mobile design and try to mimic its design right here in FlutterFlow. And for that, I went to Dribbble, which is a site where people can submit various designs. These are mobile designs or desktop designs. And I'm looking at various designs here. And right here, I found an interesting design that we can try to mimic in FlutterFlow. So for instance, let's see if we can design something like this in FlutterFlow. First, we're going to create a new page here. Just going to do blank. I'm going to call it design. And now let's go ahead and design this screen right here in FlutterFlow. So if you take a look at this design, we have here a row. This is kind of a top row. We have another row, then we have a row, but we also have various elements. This thing right here could be a row with images inside, with avatars inside, or it can be a scrollable horizontal list. And right here we have a container with a row and a list with these cards in it. All right, so let's go ahead and try to mimic it. So the first thing that we want to do is we want to create a container that's going to contain everything for this design. Click on container. Next thing I want to do is I want to remove the width and the height. Once you do that, the container is going to take the entire space of its children. So once we put stuff inside, this container is going to magically expand. Next, we're going to put a column here. Okay. And let's start putting the content. So let's go ahead and add a row right here. So we have a row, and this is going to be this row here. So inside this row, we're going to have an image. We're going to have some text. And we're also going to have some kind of an icon there. Okay, so we're going to put an icon or an icon button, okay, as you have there. So let's go ahead and take a look at this image. So let's make it a little bit smaller. So something maybe like this. So if we take this row and we center it, something like this. Next, I want to take this column here and I want to create a padding for it. So we're going to do maybe like a 10 padding. Okay, that looks pretty good. All right. Now, what we want to do in this top row here is we want to give this text a lot of space. So what we can do is we can give it an expansion right here. We want it to expand and take up the entire space here. And here we're going to give it a little bit of padding. Okay. And so now what we have is a top bar that looks kind of like that. Next, we're going to add another row here. And inside this row, we're going to have text, a text widget here. Okay, and this text widget is going to say tasks for today. We're going to make it bigger. So maybe, and we're going to give it some padding. So something like 30. Okay, next we're going to give it another row, about a row right here. And this row is going to have an image or an icon, in fact, an icon. And it's going to have some text. So it's going to say 5 available. Let's go ahead and make this a little bit smaller. Maybe the icon size of 20. Give it a little bit of left padding, something like this. Okay, so that's kind of coming together. We're going to add another row right here. And this is going to be our search stuff here. So there's a lot of things happening. So let's try a container inside the row. So let's remove the width. Let's give it a height of, let's say, 50. Okay, we're going to give it an input field. And the input field, let's go ahead and take a look if we can do a label. So we can do a label. We can also do hint text. So something like search. We can remove the label. Okay, so for this inner container here, we can do a border radius. So let's say a 10. Now, before I continue, I want to change the background color of this main container so that we can see what's happening here. So this fill color, let's go ahead and change it to something maybe this. Okay, that's a little bit too bright, maybe something beige. Okay, so something like this, and now we can see kind of what's happening. Now we can do a border radius here, and you can see our container, this outer container has a border radius. Okay, I'm going to remove this inner container. I don't think we really need it in this case. And for this container, I want to set fill color, right? So I want it to be white so that we can see what's happening, okay? And so here's our container here, and let's go ahead and set a bigger. Okay, no, actually, I think 10 was good. Now, this text field has an underline. We don't really need that because the main screen does not have it. Now, for this text, let's go ahead and create padding all around. So something like maybe 10 all around. Okay, that looks better. And the next thing we want to do is we want this thing to expand all the way. So I'm going to take this container and I'm going to do a 300 width, something like this, and maybe a height 50. Okay, that looks better. And then we can do a little bit more padding. Now it's starting to come together. Let's give a little bit of top padding to the row. And now we have the search screen. Okay, so that is what we have. Now this text field has an icon here, right? And if we click on this text field, you can specify icon properties. So you can do a trailing icon. So like glass, magnifying glass, or maybe search. Okay, yes, search. Okay, perfect. It's a little too big. So let's go ahead and fix that. Icon size, maybe 10, 15, maybe 20. 20 is probably too big. Yeah, 15 is probably okay. So that looks pretty good. Let's go ahead and center this row. Okay, that looks better. Let's go ahead and make it a little bit bigger. So maybe 350. Okay. Okay, that looks pretty good. Let's give it a little bit of top padding. 20. Okay, now that looks good. Next, we're going to create this last connection section here. So if we go to this column right here, let's go ahead and add a row. We're going to do some padding, 20. Add a text, and we are gonna call it last connections. Connections, make it a little bit bigger, maybe 16, maybe 22. Let's make it 20. Okay, so that looks kind of similar. And we're also going to duplicate this row. Now in this other row, what we can have is we can have images. Okay, so for this row, we can create various images. Okay, so let's create a bunch of images. Let's go ahead and change the width. So what is that, 20? Is that 20? But no, that's 50 by 50. We can do a border radius as well. So on the image, let's do a border radius. Okay, that looks pretty good. Let's go ahead and duplicate that. And we want to make sure that it has the right padding. So we're going to do padding to the right. Probably too much. How about 15? And we are going to duplicate it again. And we have 4, and then there is +5. So let's go ahead and duplicate it again. Now for this +5, you can create an image that just says +5 if you want, and you can put it in there. And the next thing that we need to do is we need to create this section here. Okay, and as you can see, this section has a different background color because it plays a slightly different role. And so what we want to do is we want to create another container and put stuff inside this container. It's only logical from there. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to our column here. I'm going to go to this column and I'm going to create another container. This container is going to be all the way at the bottom here, and we're going to expand the width to something like this. In fact, we can even remove the width since it takes up the whole thing right there, since it takes up the entire width. And we can also remove the height, and then we're going to add our column. And inside the column, we're going to start adding elements. But before that, let's go ahead and add maybe some padding for this column. How about something like this? And for this column, let's go ahead and add a row. We're going to add a text. And inside the text, we're going to say active. Let's go ahead and make it bigger. Okay, so something like this. Now, there's also see all, but this active projects takes the entire thing, whereas see all is kind of flushed to the right-hand side. So let's go ahead and add another text element here. We're going to say see all. And what we want to do is we want this thing to take up the entire space. Okay, so we're going to do an expansion. We want it to expand, even if it doesn't need it. Okay, we want it to be greedy with the rest of the space. Now, let's go ahead and do rounded corners here, right? So we're going to do border radius. Let's do a 10. 10 looks pretty good. Probably need a little bit more. So maybe 15. Okay, 15 looks good. Okay, that's starting to come together. The next thing that we need to do is we need to add these cards here, okay? So what we're going to do is we're going to create another row. Okay, we have this row here. We're going to create another container. And inside the container, we are going to add maybe more rows, right? So we're going to give this container some padding here, maybe, I don't know, 5, something like this. Let's remove the width. Let's remove the height as well. And we're going to add more rows inside. So we're going to add a row. And we are going to duplicate this because there's 2 pieces of text there, right? The first piece says numero 10. And then the second one has 4 hours. So I'm also going to add a column inside this row here. So I'm going to wrap this container in a column right here. And then I'm going to go to this text, this first text here, and give it an expansion. We're going to give our container a width, something like 330 here. Then we're going to go to the first text here and give it an expansion. So that way it expands all the way. So let's go ahead, make it a little bit smaller. So something like this. And as you can see, it expands all the way here. Now there's also a border there. So if we take a look at this container here, we want to create a border around it. First, let's give it a border radius. So maybe 5, okay, or maybe 10. And let's do a border color. So maybe to something like this, okay, and change the border radius maybe to 5. Let's go ahead and give it some padding to this column right here. Give it a padding of 10. Let's go ahead and add more content. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to duplicate the row. We're going to wrap it in a column. Now I have here another row, and this thing is going to say blog and social. Okay. Next, we're going to duplicate this row again. We're going to say deadline is today. And we also want to have some kind of an icon there in the beginning. Put it up on top. And this icon has like maybe something like this. Okay, let's give it some padding to the right. So something like this. And this thing needs to be larger. So it's going to be bigger. So maybe 22, and let's give it some padding here. And okay, so something like this. Okay, that looks pretty good. Let's go ahead and give it some padding. So this column, I want to have it padding from the top. So that looks good. And it also, the stuff inside needs to have its own padding. You see how it's not flush against the border. And so if we click here, we have a container, and the padding is going to be outside this container. So what we need to do is we need to have that inside of its own container. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to wrap this inside of a container, and now we can do this padding on this container. Okay, so now I can give it padding, and as you can see, we have this kind of 10, maybe 15. Okay, that looks, give it, let's make that outer container having more rounded border there. Okay, that looks pretty good, starting to come together. And also we need to have this container have padding from the top, let's say 20. And now what we can do is we can take this and we can duplicate it. Okay, so it's inside a column, so that it's absolutely fine. And so what we're going to do is we're going to duplicate this, and we're going to have another one here. And now what we need to do, we need to give it padding, right? So we're going to give it a little bit of padding from the top. Let's do it 10. Okay, that looks pretty good. All right, and this thing says something else. It says Grace Aroma, and this thing says new cap main review. Cap main review, and we really can't see what it says, but assuming it's something like this. Okay, and so let's take a look at what we have so far. Let's fix this icon here. It should be a bell. Do we have a bell? We do have kind of a bell, so something like this. And let's go ahead and remove the fill color. We don't really need that. And let's go ahead and remove the border color. We don't really need that. Okay, now here we have something resembling a bell. All right, so it's starting to come together. Change the title to tasks here. And it looks pretty good. Now, obviously, you can change some of the settings, add more containers, remove containers, add some padding. Now, if you guys are interested in improving your design, layout, UI skills when it comes to FlutterFlow, then the best way to learn is by looking at the designs that I have created here and trying out different things, as well as following the video, but right from your own computer, using this app in your own FlutterFlow instance. And the best way to do it is by viewing and or cloning this exact app that I created in today's video, and you can do just that from my Patreon page. And remember, when you join our amazing growing Patreon community, you're not going to get access to just this app right here. You're going to get access to all my FlutterFlow apps that I built on this channel. They're all there. Plus, you're going to get access to some extra content, Q&As, live streams, behind the scenes content, and our Patreon supported masterclass series where I do a deep dive on specific topics that the community votes on. And so all of that sounds like something you might be interested in. Then you definitely need to check out our amazing Patreon community and consider becoming a member. And so you can learn more about our rapidly growing Patreon community using the link in the description of the video. Now, if you guys are interested in more in-depth FlutterFlow tutorials, I'm going to have a link right there. And so that is the video you should be checking out right now.